Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Edit. Unfortunately, this is all the information I know on this story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out, and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth, and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix, and he ended up choking to death. I initially misread this as you put your finger into your own mouth to verify that it was blueberry muffin mix, and I gagged. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything, completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as a last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single, and honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food, dying alone in my apartment, my cat eating my face. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus, found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec, easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. My theory is she was gonna start carrying drugs that way, but wanted to practice with something that wouldn't kill her first. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon/medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, x-ray, or CORT of the upper chest/abdomen/pelvis. No bullet point. At that point someone said fuck it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa area behind the knee. It had embolized / traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. How the F does a bullet even fit inside a blood vessel? I was a forensic tech for a state medical examiner's office for about 2 years. I've assisted in about 1,000 autopsies and have removed bodies from scenes from likely twice that. I told these stories in another AskReddit thread about people who clean up crime scenes, and I have a few takeaways. First, man who had a psychotic break and castrated himself and stuffed it all into this mouth before cutting his own throat. Second, man who was sodomized to death with a broom, a baseball bat, and the tuning end of a guitar. Third, man who decapitated himself by hanging himself with high tension cable and jumping off a bridge. Woman overdosing whilst carrying an 8-month pregnancy. No really any major revelations like, in terms of something wild unexpected, or a medical finding that contradicts the police report. Just seen enough shit in one lifetime for 100 people. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind. I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back I pulled the sheet back and already knew he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spent the next 30 minutes getting quizzed by PD about "Are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. Seeing a cadaver that looks like an older you sounds like a Twilight Zone premise. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4/5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the air probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, fluid in the abdomen, so at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighted more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2-3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 g each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts. In order to get samples, they popped like air balls spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard, but I think I will remember forever this one, in particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. PS. I'm sorry for any mistakes, but I'm not a native English speaker. My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side and died in her 60s from a heart attack, but while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer, but she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. My wife is a pathologist assistant, and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery the resident used too much force with a forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point, now has no interest. Oh, that is absolutely horrible. The poor woman. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggle to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with shit. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life, and it didn't kill her until she was 2. Poor baby. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless. Based on his appearance and smell, he reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started on urology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories, if anyone is curious. Edit. I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they would brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied, and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. How did the shotgun blast not show any outward signs? One would imagine at least some kind of visible wound from that. That guy must have clenched his cheeks hard. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night to many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging. The professor did some digging. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. I'm a pre-med student, and one time, while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile vs pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered, and bone fragments pulled back with the skin. And when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged, and the eyeballs had been pushed back / fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad, or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. What did you do with the $9,000 in cash? While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe forehead trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head, and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden, the person was a crime scene, and they had to call the police again and leave the person as into shade as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out, there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they are made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh." Right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy shit, but the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain, and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20+ years ago, however he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show, cause the family was well known in my area. We found your son that went missing 2 decades ago. Also your wife cheated and I are with your brother Havigadone. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call "hardware disease." Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip up do happen from time to time. Holy shit. I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. I'm not a pathologist, but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by cocaine use. The heart was apparently giant, like having to use cocaine just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or 3 SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. I visited a dissection lab at a nearby university when I was in high school, and one guy was laid out on the table in front. We asked how he died, and the professor pointed at a jar and said that's how, and it was the guy's heart. It was bigger than his head. In college I took a figure drawing class and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it. So he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him in particular / not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was, unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure, dissect his penis / see why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes into shade from their dissections, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30 to 40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I'm a former police officer and attended several autopsies to record info for investigation files. One guy had been shot and killed, so the cause of death was pretty clean, but the pathologists doing the autopsy found a tumor the size of a walnut on his brainstem. He said the guy would have been dead in a few months, even if he hadn't been shot. Another guy was dead due to a steak knife being stabbed through his heart by his wife. She claimed she grabbed the knife because she was scared he was going to kill her, and when he lunged at her the knife just went in. But when the doctor pointed out a half dozen or so marks that looked like freckles around the wound, he swabbed to develop a solution that clearly showed they were tiny little poke marks. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it, until she hauled off and kabobbed him. It's not always like TV shows where the autopsy is the aha moment that solves a case, but sometimes it really is. I heard a story once about a guy who died, and completely unrelated to the main complaint, during the autopsy they found a grapefruit in his ass. Apparently it had just been there the whole time. I've heard of a navel orange, but never an anal grapefruit.